Hello, I'm Paul from Summerfield Books in Penrith. I've got a bit of a cold, so apologies if my voice is rather hoarse and croaky on this presentation. As last year, I'm going to quickly review some of the books published in 2021 that may be of potential interest to botanists. If you don't immediately recognise it, the image I've chosen for this opening slide is of Grass of Parnassus, or bogstar. It's the county flower of both Cumberland, where we are based in Penrith, and also Sutherland. 3 new handbooks were published by the BSBI this year. The first was on broom rapes. Well laid out and easy to follow with good illustrations and lots of colour photographs. A few broom rapes and toothworts are not uncommon, but many are more confined in distribution and more likely to be seen in the southern parts of the country. Several, like Orabanch alba indicated above, which unusually seems to be recorded largely in northwest Scotland, are mainly confined to coastal locations. Distribution maps also show the range of primary host species, in this case wild thyme. Broom rapes do pop up at somewhat surprising locations, so this all-colour reference handbook might result in more sightings and hopefully records being made. For those not yet in possession of the new Field Handbook to British and Irish Dandelion, Handbook 23, note that this is the first major update of the Dandelions Handbook, Handbook 9, since its publication in 1997. The substantial changes involved were felt to justify a change of title name. Bigger in size and in full colour throughout, it has been extensively revised and contains many new entries, up-to-date nomenclature, maps and descriptions. The multi-access key that supplemented the conventional key in the original handbook has been abandoned, and the new Field Handbook now uses only conventional keys. Distribution maps are now shown on the same page as the main entry. The plant silhouettes used in the original handbook, which were based on herbaria specimens and sometimes modified, have been replaced by more detailed colour photographs of predominantly live material. Every species description includes several photos that show details of flowers and leaves and sometimes habitat. Yellow can be a difficult colour in terms of resolving detail in photographs without a good camera and suitable skill in setting up and or adjusting at the photo editing stage. By and large, the photographs in this book seem to address this problem. There are also sections in the book that provide illustrations to accompany the keys for the different sections. The BSBI also published a monograph this year on British and Irish Hieracium, section Foliosa and section Prenanthoideae. 10 of the 13 species covered appear to be mainly distributed in Scotland. The book is similar in style and format to the 3 previous BSBI monographs on hawkweeds and gives very detailed descriptions accompanied by many high quality photos of plants in habitat and of key features. The Field Studies Council have produced 2 new guides in the AidCap series. Well researched and tested as usual, they are proving popular. The sphagnum mosses one is essentially a key plus brief notes on identification, a replacement in some ways for the old JNCC Sphagnum, a field guide. The AidCap Grasses Guide was designed to help field botanists and surveyors with identification outside the flowering season. Photos and notes are usefully laid out on facing pages. The photo size and quality is better by and large than comparable guides in this price range. Volume 19, Part 2 of Flora Iberica has now been published and is in stock. This completes the coverage of the grasses. The first part came out earlier this year, but it also completes the entire series of 21 volumes, in fact 25 books in total. In its entirety, they cover some 50% of European plant species, approximately half of which are endemic to the area. Quite an achievement and the result of a monumental effort involving hundreds of botanists since 1980, the first volume being published in 1985. For non-Spanish readers, the illustrations are particularly useful in the Grasses books. On the left and centre, I've compared a page of illustrations for wood fescue, both from the BSBI Grasses Handbook and the entry in Flora Iberica. The quality of the drawing is similar in both and the scale bars equivalent for the features shown. Not all species have accompanying illustrations in the Flora Iberica books, unlike the BSBI book, but typically, where present, they do include more detail. In this example, both of the external sexual parts as well as the components of the spikelet. In many such comparisons, the difference in the features illustrated is even more marked. The detail shown is akin to those in Hubbard's Crassus book, but is printed on better quality paper, so more distinct. There are also illustrations of what would be alien species in the UK, for example, Volpiella tenui, shown on the right. Useful because the illustrations in the BSBI Handbook of Alien Grasses are much less detailed or distinct. Those with an interest in the genus Carex may like to note that before the end of this year there will be a completely updated edition of Carex europea with nearly 600 colour photographs. It's 10 years since the original edition, Volume 1, and 5 years since the second edition, which came out as an ebook version but with only small changes. The second edition of the Identification Guide to Ireland's Crassus was published a few years ago, but we didn't showcase it at the time. This robust ring-bound pocket guide has proved to be quite popular since we started stocking it. Faith Anstey brought out another small guide in her Popular Beginners series on botanical identification this year, the one on Start to Identify Composite Flowers. A new reprint of the 4th edition of Clive Stace's New Flora is due out next week. The first reprint incorporated minor corrections, and this second reprint includes further corrections. No further corrections will be made in any future reprints. BSBI members can see further details of recorrections in the Botanical notes of the September 2021 issue of the BSBI News. Hard copies of all correction lists can be obtained from Clive Stace, as detailed in the BSBI News. For non-members or members as well, you might like to note that we will be uploading them as PDFs onto the Summerfield website in due course. Perhaps partly because of restrictions on movement and access to information over the last 18 months or so, the number of new botanical works about the flora of Britain and Ireland over this period has been rather slight. Here are a few that might be of interest. The Sefton Coast is an interesting area for botanising to the north of Liverpool. The small Shetland Flowers book is similar to the older one by David Malcolm, but easy to carry in a pocket. Zoe's book is a paperback reissue of all work with the same title, originally in hardback, with some small changes. Many of you will also be familiar with the checklist of Urban Flora of Scotland, which gets periodically updated in printed format by Brian Ballinger, April 2021 being the most recent. On the other side of the channel, 2 major works came out in the latter part of the year. Both are very well illustrated, large format hardback books. On the left is the first volume on the bryophytes of France, and on the right, the recently published updated edition of Prelly's well-known book on the ferns of Europe, this now much revised and enlarged work. Here we have some sample pages from the ferns book. And some sample pages from the bryophytes book. Shown here are some botanical titles on flora from Europe and the fringe areas that came out this year. The second edition of Chris Thorogood's Field Guide is perhaps the most interesting to UK users, and is a substantially enlarged and revised version of the original. The French guide is an elaborate key and requires some competence in the French language to get to grips with. The Armenia book is quite concise, but probably the first guide in English for this area. Here I've highlighted some more recently published books on flora around the world. 2 of them are updated and enlarged editions of previous works, the Flora of Azores and Peter Cheeseby's Bulbous Plants of Turkey and Iran. Both are well-known titles, and we expect stock early December. The Jianshan book, Jianshan is a mountain in China, was published in early 2019, but I don't expect that many people have seen this book before. The first author is perhaps best known as co-author of an earlier work on the flowers of the Caucasus. Indian botanical art showcases work now held at Kew that was mostly commissioned from unknown local artists in India in the 18th and 19th centuries, reflecting both their skill and the rich flora of the region. Gladioli should appear at some point in time. It's currently on its way from South Africa to the UK. Commissioned back. The recently published Illustrated Plant Glossary from Cabby is very similar to the older Kew Plant Glossary, but it is a larger and more extensive book and with much more illustration and all in colour. Shown to scale on the left, we have a page from the new book and on the right from Kew, covering the same section of the alphabet. As throughout the book, both have many common entries but also some unique ones. The new book, as well as being in colour, tends to have more complex and or detailed illustrations. Compare, for example, the entries for lateral and its subsections. The little book on the right from the Botanic Garden in Maes, Belgium, is good value for money at less than £5. Inspired by the need to assist people who will be undertaking work on collections of material from Central Africa, some of the detail is less relevant to many users, but it does pack in a lot of general information and guidance about botanical classification and naming, and is presented in a very clear and easy to follow fashion. In this slide, I've put together a collection of monographs and smaller guides, such as the excellent one on cyclamen that have been published this year, mainly on taxa of interest to both gardeners and botanists. Several interesting fungi books have been published this year. The Arboricultural Association have produced 2 excellent large format hardback books, aimed in the first instance at people working with trees. However, the quality of the photography in both books is exceptional, and the effort put into the photo guide to assist tree workers with limited mycological knowledge makes it a useful book for a much wider audience. Professor Lynn Boddy from Cardiff University is a well-known mycologist with an interest in trees, and her companion book has a wealth of material of interest to both the less specialist audience as well as the wider mycology community. Here's a sample from the Fungi on Trees photo guide. And another sample from Fungi and Trees. Merlin Sheldrake's phenomenal bestseller was reissued as a paperback this year and continues to impress people. Indeed, the upsurge in interest in fungi noted by many mycologists and others has been named the Sheldrake effect. For those new to the mysteries of the fungi kingdom, the 2 excellent inexpensive guides on the right, updated this year, are widely used and appreciated by many. The 3rd volume of Geoffrey Kibbe's treatment of fungi in Britain and Europe matches the quality of the early volumes, as you would expect from a leading field mycologist and skilled illustrator. The final volume is expected next year. The Scandinavian countries and Italy both have a long tradition of producing able mycologists and detailed authoritative works. With the exception of the Polypores book, the others shown here cover genera that historically have been either considered difficult in terms of identification and taxonomy or less studied. In that respect, they all offer something new in terms of approach and are of pan-European interest. Ranging from the entertaining to the serious, we have a collection of books here on the medical effects and uses of plants. There has been a noticeable increase in the interest in foraging over the last year or so, inspired perhaps by chefs initially, but with the upsurge of interest in the natural world that seems to occur during the COVID pandemic, publishers have rushed to produce books on the subject. We have a blog on our website where we discuss some of the merits of these books. Whilst there is obvious concern over issues such as overexploitation and habitat disturbance, there are some positive benefits in that this is a route of entry, especially for children and young adults, to look at the natural world with a keen eye and hopefully develop a lifelong interest in the subject. Good guides and reference books are essential, not just for avoiding hazardous material, but for developing identification skills. The book shown here, published first in 2019, but a little overlooked at the time, is suitable for beginners and the more experienced. It has excellent photographs, sufficiently detailed descriptions, and provides clear guidance on poisonous species to avoid. The field journal that you can buy also is produced to a similar standard and encourages making records of what, where and when something was found. Ideal training for budding recorders. Lee Ann Gale's book on the left here is an excellent practical guide to using colour, focusing on observation and applying colour theory. Very well illustrated with several hundred images. Botanical Revelation is a hefty historical work that describes in detail Europeans' early experiences with Australian flora, illuminated throughout with artworks from the period. The Flora Legion book is another fine compilation featuring over 100 full-page exquisite colour drawings from the archives of the Sheffield Botanical Gardens. Each plant has a profile describing where it was found and explaining something of its history, uses and botany. Jonathan Drury's Around the World in 80 Trees came out in paperback this year. This is an excellent bedtime read. You can see, for instance, Clive Stace's complimentary review in the BSBI News from January this year. Around the World in 80 Plants is a similar journey and written in the same engaging style. Professor Ennis is an authority on trees, and his book is another good read that explores just how important wood as a material has been throughout high history. On the left I show Mark Johnson's The Tree Experts. This is a detailed historical account on the development of modern arboriculture and touches on many aspects of the use of trees in the landscape and gardens through the ages, with some fascinating detail. Gabrielle Hemery's homage to Evelyn's classic work has rightly been highly praised. This is a more compact version of the first edition, but loses nothing in quality. Trees of North America is a very comprehensive and concise guide, while Fred Pierce, a journalist who writes widely on environmental matters, has produced an informed piece of reportage on his travels around the world visiting forested areas. He explores how he arrived at our current position with personal anecdotes of his meetings with active players trying to mitigate and redress the situation. Naturalistic planting and wilding have been themes in gardening over the last few years. Here are a few books published this year that feed into this interest. Another theme of contemporary gardening is making gardens more insect-friendly. Dave Goulson, the well-known author of books on bees, features on this slide alongside two other books that offer plenty of good advice and ideas for suitable plants. By now, Wild Guides are well known for the quality of their books and the presentation style they favour. Paul Brock's book on Britain's insects in this series is another winner. Essentially, it's a bigger format version of his previous book on insects, produced by Pisces Publications, and will appeal to those who like the Wild Guides approach. Both books are shown side by side here. Forest Insects of Europe primarily focuses on forest ecosystems and the role insects play. Well illustrated, it's written to appeal to both the general reader and the professional. Amongst the moth books published over the last few years, these two from this year stand out. Manley's book is well known and the most comprehensive identification guide we have. This is a fully revised edition covering all British macro and micro species, over 2,500 in total. The Gateway Guide is more selective, only 350 species, but is an excellent introductory field guide with illustrations that are amongst the best available in any field guide to moths. Martin Warren's book on butterflies is another good addition to the British Wildlife collection. The Wild Guides book, now in its 4th edition, is a popular field guide. There's been a veritable swarm of dragonfly books this year. The Bloomsbury books on the left have the more detailed and finely produced illustrations, but the Wild Guide books are good for showing insects in situ and will appeal to those who like the presentation style. Amongst the remaining insect books that came out this year, British Crane Flies stands out as a detailed and comprehensive piece of work with good illustrations. The RES Guide on Blowflies and the Egg Gap Guide to Freshwater Snails are typical of others in these series. The Grasshoppers book is comprehensive and again well illustrated. Several useful bird guides came out this year. Peter Harrison's Seabirds is a welcome update on his seminal original guide. The flight identification of European passerines fills a useful gap in the literature, and the Collins Birds of the World is comparable with the new Lynx edition book, All the Birds of the World, also published at the end of 2020. We featured it in last year's presentation. Whilst the Lynx book is a wonderful and comprehensive piece of work, the Collins Guide, though not as detailed, is a good economical alternative. The Bird Atlas 2 is a major revision, and Birds of China should further enhance the author's reputation built on his 2000 field guide to birds in China. Birds of Wales is a major piece of work, large and comprehensive, with exceptionally clear photos. This is the first update on the avifauna of Wales for nearly 30 years. Of course, there are many authors who write well on all things to do with birds, and here we have a selection of some recent titles that we recommend. Clive Chatters takes a broad interpretation of heathland in this interesting volume in the British Wildlife series, and it's well worth reading. The only title published in the Collins New Naturalist series this year has been Ecology and Natural History. However, a further book on the Peak District is due in December. Roy Dennis is well known as a leading light in the rewilding movement, especially for his work with ospreys and red kites. The Mar Lodge estate in the Cairngorms was acquired by the National Trust for Scotland in 1995. Regeneration charts the fortunes of conservation efforts on the estate over the last 25 years. Whilst Adam Spaulding's tendentious book makes interesting reading. Rewilding, of course, raises issues about how appropriate it is to reintroduce lost species. Here are some more titles concerned with these issues, as well as 2 new field guides. Here are a couple of interesting books that came in whilst I was preparing this presentation. Slime has been Book of the Week recently on Radio 4. Plants by Us by John Ackroyd is a book that ranges widely, touching on the startling variety of ways in which plants and people interact, to underline how integral plants are to our lives. A fascinating cook's tour of all things botanical and well worth a dip. More about all the books I've shown today can be found on the Summerfield Books website, including prices. Many are on offer. If you wish to purchase but prefer not to do so online, then you can always contact us by email or telephone. See the next slide for contact details. Attendees at the conference and resident in the mainland UK will be entitled to free postage on orders over £50. Use the voucher code EX202150 when placing your order. It is a single-use voucher and not transferable to anyone not attending the meeting. Finally, here we have a selection of some of our more popular lenses on the right, both with and without an integrated light capability. We also now supply lanyards in a greater range of colours than we've ever done before. If you visit the website, you'll be able to see the full range of our equipment. Okay, that's it for this year, and hopefully we'll be able to see some of you next year in person, either at this meeting or perhaps before. Goodbye.